Okay, we're live.
All right, good afternoon and welcome to the House Environment Committee. This afternoon, we are going to take a deep dive into phosphorus accounting methods. The Agency of Natural Resources.
Thank you so much, Chair Sheldon and the committee for having us in. For the record, my name is Emily Bird. I'm the Clean Water Initiative Program Manager at the Department of Environmental Conservation. And I'm joined today by my colleague, Claire Madden, who's our Tracking and Accounting Supervisor. Our outline for our presentation today is to walk you through a little bit of background and context on our tracking and accounting. And we heard a little bit about this a couple weeks ago, but just to kind of reset the context around why we're doing all of this work and to give you an overview of our approach to tracking and accounting and how we estimate phosphorus reductions. And then Claire has prepared some project category specific examples of how these methodologies work. So to reset on the background that brings us in today and why we're doing our tracking, accounting, and reporting work. Back in 2015, the state of Vermont passed the Clean Water Act, or Act 64 of 2015. And that was really prompted by the Lake Champlain phosphorus total maximum daily load, which is our cleanup plan for Lake Champlain. And the fact that the state needed to achieve a substantial reduction in phosphorus from what we call non-point source pollution, the rain runoff, snow melt driven sources of pollution. And so Act 64 was put into place to provide reasonable assurances that those reductions from across the landscape could be achieved. And that included putting in place our Clean Water Fund, regulatory programs to compel actions, and also it put in place a tracking system requirement to provide accountability for the investments that the state was making in this body of work, as well as to provide accountability on the results of the regulatory programs that were put into place for this body of work. Following up on Act 64, we have Act 76 of 2019, or the Clean Water Service Delivery Act, and that really built on Act 64 by adding additional revenue streams into the Clean Water Fund and came with additional connections back to our phosphorus accounting, including establishing a new formula grant program that was based on phosphorus targets and allocated funding based on phosphorus. So that's another connection back to the phosphorus accounting and modeling that we're talking about today. And all of this tracking and accounting, while it supports our reporting back to the legislature and to the public on the investments that we're making in water quality and the results of those investments, it is also our accountability tool for progress that we're making under our major total maximum daily loads. So for example, phosphorus reduction gains under the Lake Champlain TMDL, phosphorus reduction gains under Lake Memphremagog, and hopefully in the future also for nitrogen reductions in the Connecticut River. And the reporting that we present each year is also submitted to the Federal Environmental Protection Agency, and we use that as our progress report. And they use that progress report to issue report cards on how we're doing under the accountability framework of the TMDL. All of this accounting is a really useful adaptive management planning tool, meaning that it gives us a good sense of where resources are being targeted, the results of those investments, how our regulatory programs are doing, and where we may need to iterate and adapt on where we're targeting financial and technical assistance resources. Like anything, modeling is useful, but not always 100% accurate. This is really a useful planning and accountability tool, and we estimate these phosphorus reductions at the project level. And this is a useful tool because it helps us to measure incremental progress towards our target by implementing projects across the landscape and the phosphorus reductions we expect those projects to yield. But the ultimate measure of our progress is actual water quality through our tributaries and in the receiving bodies like Lake Champlain. And so that's the ultimate measure of our progress, but it will take time for those water systems to respond to all of the management actions on the landscape. And so this is a useful incremental monitoring tool in the meantime. Claire gave a nice overview, my apologies, of the performance report when we were in a couple of weeks ago. and the overview of the 4 different measure types that are included in the performance report. Just to recap, we have measures on our investments, education outreach and technical assistance, and project output measures or performance measures. Today, we're really focused on the pollutant reduction component of our reporting and how we estimate the phosphorus reductions at the project level. So with that introduction, oh wait, actually I have one more slide. And to give you a little bit of background on where all of this comes from, the Lake Champlain TMDL was a pretty model heavy technical process to put into place. The Lake Champlain TMDL, or total maximum daily load, it identifies the amount of phosphorus that needs to be reduced in order for Lake Champlain to again meet water quality standards. And in order to develop the base loading, the starting point, and the targets where we ultimately want to be, and the reductions required to get to our targets, quite a bit of modeling needed to happen. And the Environmental Protection Agency played a really big role in helping to do that technical analysis using monitoring data, actual water quality monitoring data that has been collected by the state of Vermont in partnership with the Lake Champlain Basin Program through the long-term monitoring program for decades. EPA hired a consultant called Tetra Tech to do a lot of the modeling for the watershed sources of phosphorus, as well as the internal modeling within the lake and the individual lake segments to identify what the base loading is, calibrate it to the monitored data, and then figure out what reductions were necessary to meet the in-lake criteria for water quality standards. And so that whole body of work, the modeling that was done, is really the foundation of a lot of the phosphorus reduction estimates that we're talking about today. The model that was used by Tetra Tech was the Soil and Water Assessment Tool, or SWAT, and that established for the different land use types, different soil types, and different slopes what the expected loading is for phosphorus per year. And that gave us a good baseline set of data for loading. And then to ensure that the TMDL targets themselves were achievable, Tetra Tech also worked with the state of Vermont and experts in each of the different land use sectors and the EPA to do a scenario where they looked at scenarios of project implementation based on the universe of project potential across the watershed to verify that the targets were able to be achieved. And that scenario tool was based on the SWAT modeling and the different loading rates off the different land uses there. And then building on that to support the TMDL's accountability framework, Tetra Tech helped to develop our first version of the BMP accounting and tracking tool, or BAT. And that provided some calculations. It was a calculator tool to help us estimate phosphorus reductions associated with most agricultural practices and stormwater treatment practices. But there's a lot of project types that were not included in that initial iteration of the BAT tool. And so the state of Vermont has been working, and Claire will get into a little bit more about how this process has worked, to expand on that tool and develop a calculator tool that's integrated within our management systems. And we have standard operating procedures that have gone through public comment and are posted on our website that articulate all of the methodologies and data standards associated with this body of work. And I apologize, this is very technical stuff. And so we tried to distill it down to like the really key takeaways, but just wanted to provide a little bit of that background in terms of the TMDL model, because that really sets the stage for how we're now estimating phosphorus reductions at the project level. With that, I will now turn it over to Claire.
Thanks, Emily. For the record, Claire Madden, Tracking and Accounting Supervisor for the Clean Water Initiative Program. So
Might be a good time if folks have levels for Emily. Do people have questions on that first part of the presentation?
thank you.
All right, thank you.
All right, so we refer to this body of work in estimating pollutant reductions and the data collection and reporting as tracking and accounting. So I just wanted to provide a brief definition of what we mean by tracking and accounting. The tracking piece of the work is the data collection, standardization, and data management procedures. And this involves establishing and implementing tools to support streamlined tracking and facilitate reporting by all of our reporting partners. And then the accounting piece is the estimate of reductions, which is primarily focused on sediment and nutrient or phosphorus reductions right now, as Emily mentioned. And these methods for accounting for estimated phosphorus reduction are modeled, and they're based primarily on industry standards, such as resources from EPA or the USDA NRCS, and adapted from other applicable contexts like the Chesapeake Bay program. The Chesapeake Bay is an area that also has a large-scale TMDL for phosphorus and has a lot of great resources developed that are we have drawn on. And then we build on that with scientific research that's specific to the Vermont context where there isn't other applicable standards to use or adapt. And there's a really strong intersection between our tracking and our accounting work. Accounting methods are set based on what is feasible to track the data inputs that we can reasonably collect. And the tracking tools that we develop need to support the data collection that informs our accounting. Standardization in this process is really key to ensuring that the results that we report back to the legislature and to EPA are defensible and robust and are tied back to the TMDL targets and the modeling that was done to establish those targets. Yes, next slide, please. This graphic just provides an illustration of where the data for this reporting exercise is coming from. At the bottom of the screen shows all of our reporting partners. Some of these reporting partners are submitting data from multiple different of their own managed databases. And the standardization piece comes into play in compiling all of these different data sources into a standardized framework we call the Clean Water Reporting Framework, or QWRF. Within QWRF exists the BAT that Emily mentioned, apologies for all the acronyms, the BMP accounting and tracking tool, which runs the calculations for estimating phosphorus reductions. So we centralize the data into a single database and use data reporting standards to ensure consistency and facilitate this centralized data management, again, tying back to the TMDL. There's a lot of different ways that we could approach estimating phosphorus reduction with any individual project, but it's important that we standardize this procedure so that there's consistency across reporting programs and that a BMP is counted the same way, no matter who's reporting that it's been completed.
Can you take just a second to give us some examples from each of those agencies? What kind of project they would be reporting on?
Sure, yes. Starting on the left side, the Watershed Projects database is the Department of Environmental Conservation managed database that houses clean water projects across sectors from multiple different funding sources. This could include stormwater treatment practices, floodplain restorations, riparian buffer plantings, just to a few examples. There's a lot of different types of projects in there, and they primarily are non-regulatory voluntary projects, but not exclusively. Some other A&R programs that are reporting to us include the Department of Forest Parks and Recreation is reporting to us on forest, road, and trail improvement projects. The Agency of Transportation reports to us on their transportation separate storm sewer system permit, and also on the results of the Better Roads and Grants and Aid programs. The Vermont Housing and Conservation Board reports to us on agricultural conservation and forest land conservation projects primarily. Agency of Administration is mostly a funder, and I'm not sure that any projects that are being funded through the Agency of Administration are resulting in a phosphorus reduction.
That's correct. It's just the stormwater utility incentive payments at this time.
Thank you. Agency of Commerce and Community Development similarly is a small data set and covers some mapping and sort of program development type investments. Agency of Agriculture is one of our largest reporting partners, and their managed databases feed into ours on field practice implementation and production area compliance. They're reporting to us on both regulatory and voluntary actions taken in the agricultural sector. The Lake Champlain Basin Program funds a lot of different types of projects, also primarily the non-regulatory and voluntary space, but they do fund some, provide funding support to some regulatory programs in the state. And the Natural Resource Conservation Service is also reporting to us on field-based agricultural implementation.
So we're very fortunate to have these two federal partners willing to collaborate with us on this reporting process. It really helps to round out a more complete picture of all of the great work that's happening across state and federal agencies.
Representative North.
Yeah, this is a great breadth of data
Mhm.
that you're incorporating into the overall performance reports and the data set. Are there any others besides what's shown here? These all seem to be like federal agencies, state agencies. Are there any like crowdsourced or independent special interest group type organizations that are feeding into this as well? Or is it all state and federal agencies?
At this time, our data is all coming from state agencies and these federal reporting partners.
With one exception is in the Agency of Agriculture. Their data stream includes data feeding from the Agricultural Partner Database. And there's a process that they've put into place where technical service providers like a conservation district, when they go and visit a farm to provide technical assistance, they're able to capture additional BMP data or best management practice data that the farmer's implementing without any cost share. So just practices they're doing out of good land use management. And so we're able to capture some of those data through this process that's been put into place through technical assistance.
No, just a follow-up to that, Representative North's question. So, but other organizations get funding, like the other ANR programs or something, you would be funding projects through clean water service providers that might be coming, they're in there, they're just accounted for through where the funding comes from.
Excellent. Right, yeah.
Yeah, because we've been hearing lots of good work done by lots of folks.
And that's how they're doing it.
Okay, so it comes into the agency.
Right.
We could even add another layer to this visual that shows each of these data sets have, these are all the funding programs, and then each funding program is putting grants and contracts out to hundreds of partners that are then reporting back on the outcomes of their grant funding. And we also get data back through regulatory program reporting. And so all of that feeds in. So I appreciate you bringing that up so we could give more visibility to this being even more of a spider web of data flowing into the central database.
Representative Austin.
Now, I'm just wondering how, if New York and Canada have agencies that align with this data, that they're collecting the same data. So we can look and kind of be able to extrapolate what's Vermont, what's New York and what's Canada.
That's a great question. We do collaborate very closely with New York and Quebec through the Lake Champlain Basin Program. And we actually have a project underway. Would you like to speak to that? You're on the project advisory committee.
Yeah, sure. There's a interstate tracking and accounting work group project funded by the Lake Champlain Basin Program that's looking at exactly that, of how Vermont is tracking and accounting for progress in Lake Champlain, how New York is, and where there's comparisons that can be drawn in order to achieve a whole lake reporting outcome. And so right now, the two states report separately under different TMDLs, but the goal of that is to identify where there's potential for intersection of that reporting effort to provide a more comprehensive picture of the health of the lake as a whole, regardless of the political boundaries.
Can you discern though, like if it's Vermont that might be putting more phosphorus in than New York, or you can?
Yeah, the TMDL identified the sources of phosphorus based on the modeling that Emily described and allocated the base load based on the relative contributions that each state's land area that drains to the Lake Champlain is contributing.
So Vermont contributes about 70% of the phosphorus to Lake Champlain. And that's in large part because the size of land, the area of land that drains to the lake.
Representative Tagliavia.
Do we know how the water flows in Lake Champlain? To more to Representative Lawson's question, you know, the direction of flow, how it turns over, does the water come, you know, as it comes into the lake, does it work to the surface and then work downstream? Do we have any idea of where the water actually flows, and does it shift seasonally from one side of the lake to the other?
I would certainly defer to the Lakes and Ponds program at DEC for a very deep, detailed answer on that. But the high level, yes, there are models that and monitoring data that help to answer that question. And the TMDL for Lake Champlain, it's broken up into lake segments. So they've broken up the whole lake, which is very large, into functional segments where there's more they kind of operate in a way as in separate water bodies in terms of that rotation and the tributary flow, the rivers that flow into them. And part of the TMDL modeling included what they call the bathtub model. And it looked at those internal dynamics within the lake and helped to set the targets in the TMDL based on those individual lake segments and how they behave and how they interact across the seasons and the different loading that is coming to them from the different tributaries, like the Winooski flowing into the main lake, for example, or the Wilmoyle River flowing into Colchester Bay, for example. So there's that's just a really high level answer to your question. But we'd be happy to follow up with our colleagues in the Lakes and Ponds program if you'd like to go into a deeper level of detail on that. Thank you.
All right, so this slide just presents a little bit of the path to how we got to where we are today. As Emily mentioned, in 2015, Act 64 was passed and established requirements to track and account for progress towards the Lake Champlain TMDL. In 2016, the Lake Champlain TMDL was revised with a new accountability framework that included more tracking and reporting requirements. And EPA contracted with Tetra Tech to create the BMP accounting and tracking tool, the basis of our current accounting methods. From 2016 to 2019, DEC engaged with work groups to establish the tracking and accounting systems and operationalize those systems in a centralized database. The slide previous was illustrating that. And in 2019, Act 76 was passed, which included a requirement that the state publish the methods used to account for pollutant reductions. So the work groups continued to convene for the following 3 years to document and publish the methods used to track and account for projects that occur in the agriculture, natural resource, and developed land sectors. Those documents are published on our website. The URL to access those documents is on this slide. And from 2022 until now and going into the future, we continue to engage with those work groups to identify where gaps exist in our current methodologies, operationalize the methods that are in place, and continue to improve upon the methods that we have to account for our progress. Next slide, please. So the tracking and accounting work groups are groups of sector area experts, and there's 3 sort of primary goals or products of these work groups. We work collaboratively with the members of the work groups to establish and implement the mechanisms for tracking and accounting. We also build tools and resources to support the effective use of our tracking and accounting procedures, enabling partners, those hundreds of folks, of organizations that receive state funding, to be able to report back on the results of their work. And we incrementally update documentation using recently available scientific research in order to revisit and revise where needed our tracking and accounting SOPs. Act 76 included a requirement that we revisit the pollution reduction accounting methods once every 5 years. So we're getting ready to start that process again next year to meet that 5-year cycle. The work groups also set priorities for tracking and accounting methods. So the collective body of the work group members hear from stakeholders and partners about areas of interest and bring to the work group to determine feasibility, best fit, and the level of priority in establishing new tracking and accounting methods or updating existing ones. We consider the scale of project opportunity and the mechanisms available to support the work, as well as research available to develop the tracking and accounting methods in order to determine the priority of that work. Tracking and accounting procedures also help to inform project identification, prioritization, and funding eligibility in some cases. We want to ensure that the state investments in water quality are being put towards cost-effective projects that result in phosphorus reductions that will continue to contribute to our progress in meeting the TMDLs.
Question here. So can you give us an example of, well, how does someone add a project type, or are there project types that have been added? Are there project types that have been subtracted based on we're not getting a lot of these, or they're not working, or we want to try this? How does that happen?
Yeah, so we hear from stakeholders about projects that they identify on the landscape and do our best to help support identification of which tracking and accounting method that project fits best within. And part of the resources available to support that are data standards and definitions and minimum standards that help to identify if you're planting a buffer. Our minimum standard is that the buffer width is 35 feet because that is scientifically known to provide the water quality benefit that we're accounting for. In other cases, we hear about project opportunities and they're not well represented by our existing accounting methods. We take that to the work group and try and identify a path forward to establishing and implementing that tracking and accounting method. It is depending on the project type and what research is available to support the development of new methods. It can be a long process. So we've contracted for Vermont-specific research to support the development of new accounting methods, for example, specific to Vermont's rural road networks and Vermont's forest lands and the floodplain and stream restoration projects that we see often in Vermont and don't have a ready off-the-shelf accounting method from another context. So on the right just shows some of the current work of these work groups. We're currently working with folks that are sector area experts in agriculture, in forests, streams and floodplains, and the developed land sector, which includes both stormwater and roads. Next slide, please. So I think it's important to note at this point that the methods that we use to estimate phosphorus reductions are standardized modeled results of implementation of high priority effective practices. And those methods cover commonly implemented practices in the agriculture, stormwater, natural resources, and transportation related stormwater sectors. This includes both regulatory and voluntary actions. And by having standardized methods for tracking and accounting, it ensures consistency in the practice level accounting regardless of the driver, meaning a stormwater treatment practice that's implemented under a regulatory stormwater permit is counted the same as the equivalent practice implemented as a voluntary action. We also track discharges from wastewater treatment facilities, which are a regulated point source of pollution. So discharges are measured and tracked in compliance with the NPDES, or National Pollution Discharge and Elimination System. Those do not have estimated phosphorus reductions. Those are measured results.
Meaning that the operator's actually taking measurements at the discharge and reporting back to DEC on what those contributions are.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Next slide,
Great
please.
job.
All right, this table is included on page 18 of the Clean Water Initiative Annual Performance Report. And I'm just showing it here to show at the project or practice level Where we have implemented phosphorus accounting methods, where we're in progress to some extent, and where we are have not yet identified a phosphorus accounting method. You may notice that most of the practices in the agricultural sector are implemented, and that was partially because of the large contributions that the agricultural sector has to the baseload in the Lake Champlain TMDL, but also because there's a great body of existing research to support the development and implementation of methods in that sector. Similar in the stormwater sector, there's industry standards that have been developed by EPA and are transferable to the Vermont context for many of the stormwater treatment practices that we track. And some of the others we've developed as a build off of that. In the natural resource sector, there was less transferable research to draw from. So we've seen more development time needed to establish and implement the systems of tracking and accounting. And some of that contracted work that I just mentioned, particularly in the streams and floodplain sector, represents a really innovative body of research that is specific to Vermont and has helped to set the groundwork for fully implementing those tracking and accounting methods.
So I was curious to see land like a conservation easement be going inputted into your tracking there on the slide we paused on. Because that just, it doesn't necessarily change management or implement a practice.
Yes.
So you're saying maybe you're tracking, you're keeping track, but it's not changing our phosphorus. It's not reducing phosphorus.
Yes. Right now, there are several funding programs that provide funding support for various types of land conservation and easements. So we track the funding that's being invested in those efforts, and we track the output measures or the performance measures, for example, acres conserved by easement. We have not yet implemented accounting methods to estimate a phosphorus reduction associated with conservation easements. It has been raised as a potential future development, but we have not yet established that piece of our accounting. And to your point, I think that there may be some research needed to support what that pollution reduction benefit looks like for what we would call a passive restoration or a non-intervention type of management.
So I saw you, Representative Pritchard, but I'm going to ask one more just follow up. So are we and particularly in this natural resource section, are we kind of creating our own model? Like, are we implementing practices and then monitoring them and seeing what the benefits are?
Yeah, we are taking a slightly different approach depending on which type of practice we're talking about. And I do have a couple of slides that go into a little bit more detail on the approach to each of those, if that would be appropriate to.
We'll definitely wait. Representative Pritchard.
Could you explain to me what might be a private wastewater upgrade system?
Yes, private wastewater would be like a septic system, and that's another example of there's a funding program to support private wastewater improvements, and we have not yet assigned a pollutant reduction accounting method that piece of work that the state is funding.
Well, an upgrade, what do you mean by that? Just a renewal of a worn out system or a different system, or what's an upgrade?
Yes, an upgrade is a retrofit to either increase the capacity or the type of treatment to improve the treatment to meet current standards. So it could be a couple different approaches to essentially increase the functionality of the system.
Because they've gotten quite a bit more elaborate, some of these systems.
There's a lot of newer technology that can be implemented to improve the treatment.
Thank you.
Thanks. All right, next. Oh, actually, I will pause right here. So I heard interest on some of the natural resource accounting methods. I have details on a lot of our accounting methods. I wanted to just be conscious of time and make sure to get to the areas of most research, most interest. We can jump right to the natural resource sector first, and then
We still have 20 minutes, so you can decide if we need to do that or not. Representative Tagliavia.
Going back one slide, back to, add on to Representative Pritchard's question with regard to private wastewater systems. Are there cost shares or some sort of incentive plan for someone who has a private wastewater system that they suspect is failing or is failing?
Yes, there is a new funding program called the Healthy Homes Initiative you might have heard of. And that was really started with the American Rescue Plan Act funding. And that provided financial assistance to individuals who are dealing with issues of non-functional on-site wastewater systems. And there's also an on-site wastewater loan program that DEC administers. So there are some grant funding, or actually beneficiary payments. And then there's also some loan options available too, depending on the individual and what they'd be eligible to receive in terms of the level of financial assistance. Thank you.
Because the agricultural sector represents a large portion of our estimated phosphorus reductions that we've been able to report so far, I'll just provide a brief overview of the approach here. And this approach is very similar in other sectors. So we start with the baseline phosphorus loading rate, which is a rate in kilograms of phosphorus per acre per year that's derived from the TMDL modeling that Emily talked about earlier. It's based on land use, soil type, and slope. And then we multiply that acreage-based loading rate times the area of acres treated. This is tracked as a data input. This could be the acres of cover crop planted, for example. That gives us the estimated phosphorus load prior to the implementation of the management practice. We take that baseline load and multiply by a BMP phosphorus reduction efficiency. These are established efficiencies based on scientific research or industry standards in the agricultural sector. The Natural Resource Conservation Service has a lot of resources available to support the BMP efficiencies that we use. And that the product of those two results in the estimated phosphorus reduction in kilograms per year that we report in our performance report. Each practice also is assigned a design life. In the agricultural sector, many of the field-based practices are a one-year design life, meaning they're implemented for a growing season and need to be re-implemented every year in order to sustain results. We also track production area compliance, which is a piece of the required agricultural practices and confirmed through inspections by the Agency of Agriculture. Inspection frequency is determined by farm size, and we track production area in acres, which is quantified during the inspection process. Multiply that by the loading rate applicable to production areas, which is derived from the TMDL, again, based on several factors. Slope, soil type, farmstead size, and that gives us the baseline phosphorus load. We then multiply that load by the efficiency, which is based on, again, an industry standard, and get an estimated phosphorus reduction to report. The design life for production area compliance is tied to the inspection cycle frequency. So large farms are inspected every year, medium farms are inspected once every 3 years, and small farms once every 7 years. Next slide, please. All right, I'll talk about buffers too. This shows agricultural buffers, but we actually account for forested riparian buffers in other land use contexts in the same way. So buffers have a two-part phosphorus reduction calculation. One part is accounting for the treatment of overland flow that is intercepted by the buffer and before it reaches the waterway. So that is the phosphorus load, which is calculated as a 5 times the planted buffer area multiplied by the BMP phosphorus reduction efficiency, again, based on an industry standard and research. And then we add to that the land use conversion of taking the buffer area out of, for example, cropland, and into forest land, which has a lower acreage-based loading rate. The sum of those two phosphorus reductions is accounted for and reported in our performance report. All right, I'm going to skip over stormwater and get to the natural resources sector, and then we can go back to stormwater if that's also of interest. All right. So we account for a couple different types of work in the natural resource sector, primarily forests and streams. One area that we track is the use value appraisal program, or current use, which is tracked by the Department of Forest, Parks and Rec and the Department of Taxes. In order to estimate a phosphorus reduction associated with current use, we take the baseline phosphorus load, again derived from the TMDL for forested lands, multiply that by the acres enrolled, and we do have a couple of criteria that are applied to which acres we count, because the enrollment of parcels in the use value appraisal program, it only represents a change in the baseline condition for parcels that were enrolled after the TMDL modeling period. So we don't want to account for phosphorus reductions that were already sort of in place when the modeling occurred. So only newer enrolled acres that have been inspected for compliance with their forest management plan, which means they are meeting the acceptable management practices, or AMPs, which are a set of standards for protecting water quality in forest lands. So that gives us the phosphorus load, acreage-based load, and then multiplied by a phosphorus reduction efficiency. This one was derived based on a review of scientific research and also some resources available through the Chesapeake Bay program. Right. We track road improvement work on forest roads and trails. This is done through a forest road erosion inventory, which determines a road segment based compliance score, assessing how well these transportation networks through our forests are meeting the acceptable management practice standards. That inventory scores segments as does not meet standards, partially meets the standard, or fully meets the standard. And hydrologically connected segments are prioritized for improvements, which means road segments that are located in close proximity within 100 feet of a water body, or upslope and draining to a segment that's within 100 feet of a water body. For this accounting method, we take the baseline phosphorus loading rate. In this case is a linear loading rate, so kilograms per kilometer per year. And then we multiply that by the road segment length, which is collected through completion of the road erosion inventory to get the base load. And then multiply the base load by the phosphorus reduction efficiency. The phosphorus reduction efficiency for forest road and trail projects is determined based on a change in the segment score. So segments that have BMPs implemented to move them from does not meet standards to fully meet standards receive an 80% phosphorus reduction efficiency. Segments that have a change in score from does not meet to partially meets, or partially meets to fully meets, that represents a smaller improvement and has a 40% phosphorus reduction efficiency. Those efficiencies were adapted from a study that focused on municipal roads that was completed by Wemple and Ross in 2015 to support the standards set in the municipal roads general permit. Right. And for floodplains and streams, the Lake Champlain TMDL was fairly innovative in its ability to allocate a portion of the base load and target load allocation to stream stability. It acknowledged that unstable and eroding streams contribute phosphorus to the lake and set targets to reduce that loading by restoring streams to more natural and stable form. The phosphorus base loading and load reduction targets are tied to the evolution of streams and rivers to a more stable, less erosive equilibrium condition. The figure in the middle of the screen shows sort of a time series, I guess, of how streams evolve and erode through various sort of states to a more stable equilibrium condition is the terminology. Some of this occurs naturally as our rivers move across the landscape, and some of this can be achieved through intentional active restoration projects. The phosphorus accounting methods that we use in the stream sector are all based on managing streams towards a more equilibrium state where possible. And the Functioning Floodplains Initiative is one body of research and tools that represents Vermont-specific contracted work to support the tracking and accounting systems. The FFI tool was developed to support project identification, prioritization, and the calculation of pollution reduction benefits. And I noticed that a couple of people from the Rivers program are going to join you later in the week. So I'll keep it a little high level for now, and they have a lot more detail. Essentially, the premise of all of this research is that breaks in connectivity in our stream systems create an imbalance between otherwise beneficial processes of erosion and deposition in stream networks. And they interrupt the inundation-related processes of storing sediment and associated nutrients. So there's 4 types of connectivity that are important to achieving equilibrium conditions in our river systems. Lateral and vertical connectivity focus on restoration techniques that reduce the incision ratio, which is the difference between the stream bed and the bank, or basically how deep the channel is. A smaller incision ratio allows a river to more readily access its floodplains, reduces erosive force, and
You think we're gonna pray for this?
Okay.
I don't wanna, but I want to make sure we get to stormwater because I think it's interest in the committee and intro from Shane Jakewith on this as well. When we talked some about beavers, he kind of walked us through river stuff too. So it won't be the first time on Friday when we hear it again.
Okay. Thank you for that.
More just how does this, like, just that fits in a similar way to the other ways you're accounting for it.
Yes, all of the modeling that was done to support FFI also draws on the same TMDL inputs and those baseline loads.
Great. Thanks.
All right. Yes. Okay. So structural stormwater BMPs include a wide range of different types of practices that are implemented to capture and treat stormwater runoff. This can include gravel wetlands and rain gardens, infiltration trenches, those types of practices. Again, here we take the baseline phosphorus loading rate derived from the TMDL and based on land use, slope, and soil type. Multiply that by the drainage area. This is the acres draining to and treated by the practice that's being implemented. And that gives us the load. And then the phosphorus reduction efficiency is multiplied by the load. The phosphorus reduction efficiency for structural stormwater BMPs is primarily based on industry standards developed by EPA and varies based on practice type, storage volume, and infiltration rate. All of the structural stormwater BMPs have what's called a performance curve. It's a logarithmic curve, acknowledging that there's not a linear increase in treatment as the practice is upsized and subsized, if that makes sense. So that results in our estimated phosphorus reductions. And then I can touch briefly on transportation-related stormwater. This is primarily tracking the results of the municipal general permit, which also uses the road erosion inventory framework to track compliance with municipal roads general permit criteria and scores all municipal roads as not meeting standards, partially meeting standards, or fully meeting standards. Here again, hydrologically connected segments are prioritized for improvements to ensure that that work is targeted towards the road segments that are most likely to be contributing to our water quality challenges. We take a baseline phosphorus loading rate, which in this case is derived from the TMDL modeling and has been adjusted based on road type, slope, and baseline segment score, and multiply that by the segment length, which is collected via the road erosion inventory to get our baseline phosphorus load. The reduction efficiencies here again are based on that change in compliance score through the implementation of a suite of BMPs that meet that ensure that the road segment is meeting the municipal road general permit standards, which were developed by a study that was looking specifically at Vermont roads and the effectiveness of linear treatment practices on roads in treating water quality challenges. So maybe I'll pause there and see if there's any areas where we could revisit for a little more clarification or
Representative North.
Yeah, a question on both transportation and the developed areas, like the
Yes.
3 acre rule or dealing with roads. Those are primarily dealing with runoff from impervious surfaces, right? And so you're calculating just linear length of a road or area of a parking lot or area of roofs and whatnot. And then using that to figure out how much phosphorus there's running off. But it doesn't seem to me there would be any phosphorus running off of a hard road or a roof. I mean, there's no soil to be eroding. It's a hard surface. And so how does that translate into phosphorus based on the area of a parking lot or a roof?
That's a good question. I'll start and then feel free to chime in. So unlike a agricultural field where the soil is the source of phosphorus, in the developed lands sector, there is atmospheric deposition and other types of sources of phosphorus that can build up, and especially on impervious surfaces where infiltration isn't possible, they sort of just sit on the surface and then the next rainstorm flushes them off. So the treatment practices are designed to contain that flush of sort of accumulated, there's some.
Yeah, like leaf litter.
Yes.
Pet waste.
That's
Like,
gotta be significantly less than an agricultural field source, I would have, right? I mean,
So the TMDL modeling did assign the acreage-based loading to each specific land use and using those criteria of soil type and slope where that's applicable. They're all different. So the agricultural sector has several different types of land uses with a array of loading rates, and the developed land sector also is broken out into many different land uses with variable loading rates depending on the type of land use and the estimated load.
so the load from a developed surface isn't so much due to, it is due to the surface area and the washing of that surface area, dust falling on it, leaves falling out, whatever. Not so much because you're creating an additional flow into, say, the stream that's next to it. So it's not so much the stream that it's all running into that's running faster and causing more stream bed erosion. It's just about the leaf litter and whatnot on the surface, hard surface itself. Is that my understanding?
I think both of those are impacts that runoff from impervious surfaces can have. There's the wash off, the buildup and wash off of pollution on those hard surfaces. And then there's also the altered, what we call hydrology in the landscape, where in a natural situation, the rain runoff would have a chance to settle, infiltrate, slow down. Where you have those hard surfaces, it runs off more quickly, more velocity, causes more erosion, whether it be in the land next to it or in a stream. We actually have some stormwater impaired rivers in the state that are altered. The rivers themselves, the condition of them are not meeting standards because of too much stormwater that is in the watershed.
Those factors are.
Yes. Thank you for bringing that up. That's a great point.
Well, that's a great question. This is for phosphorus TMDL. And then those impaired streams are under a different impairment. I mean, they have to do that. Those are the MS4 towns that have to have their own stormwater practices for the increased flow. You're not, are you tracking both here?
We are, the reporting through the MS4 permit, they have flow restoration plans to address the stormwater impairment. And the practices they're putting in place to address flow also have a phosphorus benefit and count toward their phosphorus control plan. So there's an overlap of those activities contributing to both goals, and both get reported into this system. and are captured in our reporting.
Representative Labor.
Thank you. I'm coming from the Northeast Kingdoms. Seymour, Echo Lakes, with very low phosphorus levels. And I'm wondering if you've had the opportunity yet to measure the increase or decrease of phosphorus in those levels in those lakes subsequent to the use of heavy weighted wake boats. Is it stirring up legacy phosphate?
It's a great question. I don't have an answer to that, but we could make note of that and follow up with you.
It's our second lakes and ponds questions. We may have them in. So, yeah. Any more modeling questions? Looks like you have a couple more resource slides for.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to, before we close out, just to make note of all of the tools and resources that are available or under development to support this work, not only at the state, but also all of the partners that contribute to the reporting. And that includes the reporting partners that were listed on an earlier slide, but to your great point, also all of the recipients of state assistance. And so we have those standard operating procedures for tracking and accounting, published documents covering agricultural, natural resources, and developed land sectors. We have data reporting standards, which include the definition and minimum standards for each project and practice type, and the required data inputs that we need to receive back in order to estimate a phosphorus reduction. We're also working on practice-specific guidance to support partners in implementing projects to meet the standards that we're asking. We're developing and posting recorded trainings to support the understanding of this practice-specific guidance. And we have a guide to phosphorus accounting eligibility, which indicates for each practice, project type and practice type, the specific conditions that are required in order for us to account for phosphorus. The interim phosphorus reduction calculator tool is a spreadsheet-based tool that's available to partners to provide preliminary estimates on phosphorus reduction potential for projects that are in the planning and development phases, so they can get a sense of the benefits that might be achieved through implementing that project. We touched on the Functioning Floodplains Initiative. You'll hear a lot more about that. It's a really interesting and great tool. And then we're working on additional assessment tools, including the Forest Roads and Trails Protocol, which is housed in Survey 123. It's an app-based survey that allows implementers to go out into the field and complete the survey and assess the road condition at the project location. Similar approach being developed for private residential roads. And there's work underway to establish a wetland phosphorus retention web tool that I anticipate may look similar to the Functioning Floodplains Initiative, taking a large body of research on the retention potential of wetland areas and building a user-friendly tool to help estimate those phosphorus reductions where wetland restorations are occurring. I think we have just one more slide. So these are the areas in bold where work is underway. We're working to fill gaps and implement new methods, both in tracking and accounting. And I just want to note before we close out that the last couple of years have introduced an interesting new dynamic, partly established through some of the new funding structures in Act 76, and particularly the water quality restoration formula grants, where clean water service providers are now tasked with administering state funding in order to achieve a phosphorus reduction benefit or target. So the estimated phosphorus reduction potential of projects is driving funding decisions for that funding program specifically. And there's been a lot of interest in adding more project types and more accounting methods. I hope this overview today has helped to illustrate the work behind establishing new accounting methods and especially in these areas where development is underway, work is in progress. There is research that needs to be completed in order to have a scientifically defensible approach to estimating a phosphorus reduction in a standardized way. And so that work is ongoing. And the goal and the focus of the work groups that we convene to support all of this work is to identify where there's new opportunities and help to prioritize that work in a way that is actionable.
Thank you both so much for your presentation and for all you're doing to help us keep track of our water quality improvements. Quick question, I hope, but under this chart here, wetland restoration, will beaver created wetlands be included in that newly updated tracking method?
I don't know that that is within the scope of the current research project that's underway. We did receive an inquiry of, I think, from the same person that's coming to speak with all of you. So that's a great example of we're taking that and bringing it to the tracking and accounting work group to discuss an approach to addressing that gap.
Thank you again.
Thank you so much.
Members will take a 5-minute break and reconvene at 10 past.
Thank you so much for having us in.
Yeah, that's